Hello, and welcome to the third lecture of International Human Rights Law, Prospects and Challenges. Today we'll talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the origin of all of the legal instruments that we'll be discussing in this course, so it's important to spend a bit of time understanding its origins and its content. We'll begin by talking about human rights in the United Nations, then turn to a brief overview of the drafting of the Declaration and its adoption, and then spend a bit more time on the content of the UDHR. What are the rationales for human rights protection in the document? What are the rights and freedoms specifically that are protected? And what limitations or restrictions can governments impose on those rights, and in what circumstances? Let's begin with the United Nations. So this is an international organization formed at the end of the Second World War in the wake of the violence and atrocities of that conflict, which we discussed in the previous lecture. At the time of the UN's foundation, some countries, mainly smaller countries, wanted to include an International Bill of Rights in the Charter itself. That wasn't done at the time the Charter was adopted in 1945, and that was in part due to the press of time, but also because there wasn't yet widespread agreement on which rights ought to be included. Nevertheless, the Charter does include some general references to international human rights. In fact, one of the purposes identified of the United Nations in Article 1 is to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. In addition, the member states of the United Nations pledged to work together to promote universal respect for and observance of those rights and freedoms. But what do we mean by human rights? We don't have a definition of those rights within the Charter itself. Shortly after the UN was established, the member states tasked a new UN body, the UN Commission on Human Rights, to come up with an International Bill of Rights. Now, the Commission quickly decided that it would make sense to have a non-binding declaration of principles rather than immediately a legally binding document. And as we'll talk about in the coming weeks of the course, this use of non-binding norms, sometimes referred to as soft law, is quite common in the international human rights system. So the drafters of the declaration, the members of the Commission from different legal systems around the world, put together the document that became the UDHR and submitted it to the General Assembly in 1948. And the General Assembly adopted it without any dissenting votes, by a vote of 48 in favor and 8 abstaining states. But what isn't striking is that countries from all regions of the world supported the declaration. Now, it's worth noting that many countries had not yet emerged from colonialism, and so the membership of the United Nations was much smaller in 1948 than it is today. But as those countries did become independent and achieve their independence, they too supported the principles in the Universal Declaration. So with that in mind, I think it's worth talking a bit about the substance or content of the Declaration. The content of the UDHR includes a number of elements. The Preamble, which lists the justifications or rationales for the document, 30 substantive articles, which include civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, and limitations and duties. The major themes of the document are dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Before proceeding with the lecture, I'd like you to click on the link and review the entirety of the UDHR for yourselves. It's a fairly short document, and when you've read it, please continue the lecture. One way of conceptualizing the relationship among the different provisions of the Declaration is René Cassin's portico of the UDHR. Cassin was one of the members of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and he was actively involved in the drafting of the Declaration. This conception integrates at the base level, or the steps, the themes in the Preamble with the different pillars of types of rights in the main building, and the portico dealing with duties and limitations. Now, this is one way of viewing the instrument as a whole, but as we will see, each of the pillars in particular have been the subject of subsequent international agreements and negotiations, and we'll explore those in depth in this course. For now, I'd like you to take a look in particular at the preamble. And if you were to read that document and those paragraphs, you would notice there are quite a few justifications for recognizing the international protection of human rights. These justifications are not mutually exclusive, and they include a variety of different reasons why we might think that recognizing a catalog of rights and freedoms of all human beings was desirable. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that the Declaration contains such a mix of different rationales? And I think the answer to that question lies in the fact that the drafters of the Declaration, who were members of the UN Commission, could agree on the list or catalog of protected rights and freedoms, but they couldn't fully agree on the rationales for protecting those rights. And nevertheless, the document listing rights and freedoms is a real achievement, but the absence of a unified justification or rationale might be relevant to some of the more challenging questions of cultural relativism that we'll explore at the end of this week. For now, take a look briefly at the different lists or types of rights that appear in the UDHR. Here are civil and political rights, which are largely negative liberties that require the government to refrain from acting. The next set of rights are economic, social, and cultural rights, which require the government to engage in some kind of affirmative conduct to meet a minimum essential baseline of human needs in particular areas, such as those in housing, health, food, and so forth. And finally, limitations and duties. And here you see in the second paragraph of Article 29 a very important clause that serves as the basis for further lawmaking in international human rights and for a variety of different, very interesting and also challenging disputes about when it's appropriate to limit individual freedom. We'll discuss those disputes in some detail throughout this course. For now, I invite those of you who are interested in learning more about the UDHR and its individual provisions to click on some of these links for more information.